Sometimes life feels like a performance, one you've rehearsed for years. You've met the milestones, played the roles, followed the script, and yet, something inside doesn't quite settle. There's a quiet unease, a subtle ache, like a question that refuses to be silenced. Is this really it? That ache isn't a flaw. It's a doorway. Not everyone sees it that way. Most people rush to cover it. More goals, more noise, more certainty. But what if that restlessness is not something to fix, but something to understand? And what if understanding it begins not with answers, but with letting go? Buddhism points to this exact moment, the moment when the familiar stops making sense, and we're left staring into something uncertain. It doesn't offer more things to hold on to. It offers a radical shift in how we see everything. At the center of that shift is a teaching often misunderstood and sometimes feared: emptiness. In Western culture, emptiness sounds like despair, a lack of meaning, a void. But in the language of awakening, emptiness isn't the absence of something. It's the absence of illusion. It's no black hole of hopelessness. It's a clear space where truth can be seen. It's not that life has no meaning. It's that meaning doesn't come from clinging. It comes from clarity. Emptiness, in Buddhism, means that nothing exists independently. Nothing has a fixed, unchanging core. Not your identity, not your emotions, not even your suffering. Everything arises in dependence on causes and conditions. That includes you. And this, surprisingly, is good news. Because what isn't fixed can be free. Imagine how much suffering comes from trying to hold life still. We grasp at identities, defend our opinions, cling to relationships, chase permanence in a world that never promised it. No wonder we feel exhausted. No wonder we feel disconnected. The struggle isn't because we're broken. The struggle is because we're clinging to something that was never solid to begin with. This series is not a lecture on Buddhist theory. It's a path, a gentle but powerful journey through what it means to live from the wisdom of emptiness. Not as an idea, but as an experience. Not to reject life, but to see it clearly, engage it fully, and stop being trapped by it. Together, we'll explore how emptiness applies not just to ancient sutras, but to the modern mind, to your sense of self, your perception of the world, your emotions, your relationships. And most importantly, we'll see how understanding emptiness is not an intellectual game. It's the heart of freedom. So if you've ever felt like there must be another way to live, one less built on fear, defense, and striving, this is your invitation. Not to believe more, but to cling less. Not to escape life, but to walk through it with eyes open, hands open, heart open. This is where the journey begins. Emptiness of self. You are not a fixed identity. We live in a culture that teaches us to define ourselves early and cling to that definition tightly. From the moment we can speak, we're asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" As if who we are must always be something we can declare, prove, or package neatly for others to understand. We begin to wear titles like badges: student, achiever, leader, helper, mother, survivor. Some empower us, others quietly imprison us. But what if the self you've been protecting, defending, and building all these years isn't as solid as it seems? What if the idea of you is more like a story than a structure? In Buddhist thought, this is where the teaching of emptiness meets the concept of self. Emptiness doesn't mean you don't exist. It means the self is not a fixed, independent entity. The self is not a thing, it's a process, a fluid unfolding of thoughts, emotions, roles, memories, and sensations arising and passing moment by moment. Like waves in the ocean, they move through us, but they are not us. A woman once shared during a therapy session that, after decades of being a wife, a mother, and a manager at a large company, she suddenly found herself divorced, retired, and alone in a quiet house. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered. What she was really touching wasn't just grief or disorientation. It was the raw edge of ego emptiness, the dissolution of roles mistaken for identity. And beneath that, the first glimpse of something far more real: presence. The Buddha offered a metaphor that still speaks across centuries: the chariot. Take it apart: wheels, frame, axle, seat, and you won't find chariot anywhere. It's simply a name we give to a collection of parts arranged in a certain way. In the same way, what we call self is just a convenient label we give to a temporary arrangement of conditions. Remove the conditions, or even just pause to observe them carefully, and you'll realize there's nothing solid to grasp, just movement, just process, just life. This isn't a denial of your uniqueness. It's freedom from the illusion that your uniqueness must be frozen in place. When we let go of a fixed identity, we don't become less. We become more open, more able to respond instead of react, more spacious in the face of change, because we're not trying to protect a version of ourselves that no longer fits. Modern psychology increasingly echoes this truth. Dr. Gabor Mate speaks about the false self we construct to survive childhood wounds, an identity shaped not by who we are, but by who we needed to be. Carl Jung said, "We are not what happened to us. We are what we choose to become." Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the Holocaust, wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response." And in that space, Buddhism invites us to meet our true nature, not as a fixed idea, but as awareness itself. Another man shared his story. After being laid off from a job he'd poured his soul into for 20 years, he spiraled into depression. "If I'm not this title," he said, "then who am I?" It took months of therapy, silence, and inner work to realize. The suffering came not from losing the job, but from confusing the job with the self. When he began to see thoughts like "I failed" as just that, thoughts, not truths, something loosened. "I didn't disappear," he said. "I just stopped holding on so tightly." This is the heart of the teaching. When we say emptiness of self, we're not saying you don't matter. We're saying you are not limited to your past, your roles, your labels, or even your mind. You are not a thing to be completed or perfected. You are a living mystery, fluid, spacious, unfolding. The practice begins with awareness, watching your thoughts like leaves on a river, hearing the voice in your head say, "I'm not enough," and gently asking, "Who is speaking?" Not to argue, but to observe, to stay, to feel. You may notice the thought softens when it's not held so tightly. You may realize the self isn't something you find, but something you stop trying to define. You are not the voice in your head. You are the awareness that hears it. You are not the story. You are the space in which the story arises. And when you rest in that space, everything changes. Not because the world becomes easier, but because you are no longer trying to fit yourself into something small. This is not emptiness as loss. It is emptiness as possibility, a space in which the wind can move, the sky can open, the heart can breathe. In letting go of a fixed self, you begin to notice a deeper rhythm underneath the noise, a kind of peace that isn't earned or built, but remembered. It was always there. It just got covered up by all the things you thought you had to be. Emptiness of self is not an idea to agree with. It's a truth to feel in your bones, a homecoming. And as we begin this journey together, it's the first door we open, the door that leads inward, not to answers, but to freedom. Emptiness of things. Everything exists in relationship. We tend to see the world as made of separate things: a tree, a chair, a person, a cup. Each object seems to stand on its own, solid and distinct. This is how we've been taught to perceive reality, as a collection of things with clear boundaries and independent identities. But what if that's not how the world truly is? Buddhism teaches that things only appear to exist independently. In truth, everything, arises in dependence on countless causes and conditions. This is the essence of emptiness, not that things don't exist, but that they don't exist by themselves. Everything exists in relationship. Take something as simple as a cup. On the surface, it seems obvious. A cup is a cup. But look closer, and you'll see the web behind it. That cup exists because of clay, water, heat, the potter's hands, the tools they used, the knowledge they gained, the teacher who taught them, the parents who raised that teacher. The earth provided the minerals, the rain fell at the right time, the sun warmed the soil. The cup is not a single thing. It's a convergence of conditions, an event more than an object. This is not abstract philosophy. It's a shift in how we see the world. When you realize that nothing stands alone, everything begins to soften. The edges blur. The thingness of things gives way to something deeper. Relationship, flow, interdependence. You stop asking, "What is this?" and begin asking, "What supports this? What is this connected to?" The Buddha described this insight in simple but profound terms. When this exists, that arises. When this ceases, that ceases. It's not poetry. It's physics of the heart. The rain falls because clouds form. The clouds form because water evaporates. Water evaporates because sunlight touches it. Your breath exists because trees offer oxygen. You exist because someone fed you, and they existed because someone fed them. Look deeply, and nothing exists alone. This view changes everything, including how we see suffering. If everything arises from causes and conditions, then pain isn't punishment, it's a process. It's not who you are, but something happening. And just as it arose, it can change. What supports it can be seen, addressed, softened. The moment we see this, we begin to respond with curiosity rather than judgment. We don't ask, "Why am I like this?" We ask, "What gave rise to this? What's feeding it? And what might I shift?" This way of seeing can also transform how we relate to others. If no one stands alone, then no one's story is isolated. That rude stranger in traffic might be carrying 1,000 invisible threads: grief, trauma, fear. You don't excuse behavior, but you understand its complexity. You don't condone harm, but you stop assuming it's personal. You begin to see that just as the cup doesn't exist independently, neither does the conflict, the misunderstanding, or even the blame. One woman once shared that when she saw her angry father not just as an angry man, but as a product of war, loss, poverty, and silence, she felt a strange mixture of sadness and compassion. "It didn't excuse what he did," she said, "but it freed me from hating him." That's the power of seeing relationally. You shift from labeling to understanding, from resisting to softening. This also applies inward. When we look at our own fear, shame, or anxiety, not as flaws, but as effects of something deeper, we move from self-blame to self-inquiry. Maybe your anxiety isn't who you are, but the ripple of a nervous system shaped by too much unpredictability. Maybe your guilt isn't moral failure, but the echo of unmet needs colliding with high expectations. When we look at ourselves through the lens of interdependence, we stop punishing ourselves for being human. Thich Nhat Hanh coined the term interbeing to capture this truth. You are in everything, and everything is in you. The flower is made of soil, rain, sunlight, time, and space. You are made of thoughts, experiences, ancestors, stories, air, and breath. Even your smile is not just yours. It contains the presence of everyone who's ever made you feel safe. Interbeing doesn't erase you. It reveals that you are more than just one isolated self. You are a node in the vast web of life. This is the heart of emptiness, not a cold void, but a living field of connection. And once you see it, you begin to live differently. You listen more. You judge less. You pause before reacting. You hold your life like you would hold a bird, gently, knowing it was never yours to keep, only to care for. Emptiness of things means we no longer look at life through the lens of ownership. That's my body, my idea, my truth. Instead, we look through the lens of participation. This body arises from earth and food and lineage. This idea came from books, teachers, dreams, and contradictions. Even this breath, I can't hold on to it. I can only receive it and release it. Everything exists in relationship. And when we truly see this, not just conceptually, but with the clarity of lived experience, we begin to move through the world with a kind of reverence. Not because things are fragile, but because they are precious. Nothing is separate. And because nothing is separate, everything matters. To live in the truth of emptiness is not to withdraw from life, but to step into it more fully. To feel its textures, its tensions, its tenderness. To see the ordinary, your coffee cup, your friend's voice, the evening wind, as part of something vast, fluid, and sacred. We may never grasp all the causes that led to this moment, but we can bow to them. And in doing so, we become less obsessed with control and more attuned to connection. The world doesn't need more people who cling. It needs more people who can see the web, who can breathe with it, dance with it, and care for it. And that begins the moment we stop seeing things as things. Emptiness of perception. What you see is not all there is. We like to believe we see the world as it is, that our eyes, our minds, and our experiences offer a reliable map of reality. But perception, in truth, is not a mirror, it's a lens. And every lens distorts. What we see is never just what's in front of us. It's what we believe is in front of us. Our past, our conditioning, our emotions, our fears, all shape what enters our awareness. A raised eyebrow might seem like judgment, because that's what we learn to expect. Silence in a conversation might feel like rejection, because that's what we fear. We don't just see, we interpret. We don't just hear, we assign meaning. Our perception is not pure observation. It's filtered through layers we rarely examine. This is where the Buddhist teaching of emptiness becomes especially transformative. Emptiness doesn't mean nothing is real. It means nothing we perceive has inherent meaning or identity, because all perception arises in dependence on our mental formations. In other words, what we experience is not the thing itself, but a construction shaped by both the object and our mind. Imagine walking into a gallery and seeing a painting. One person feels awe, another feels indifference, a third feels confusion. The painting is the same, but the perception differs. The emotional meaning doesn't reside in the painting. It arises between the viewer and the image. Reality is not a fixed canvas. It's a dynamic interaction. The same is true of the people we meet, the places we go, and even the sense of self we carry. We don't perceive a thing as it is. We perceive it as it appears to us. And as it appears to us is shaped by memory, trauma, culture, language, and even the time of day. You don't look at your partner the same way when you're tired, or stressed, or hopeful. The same person seems different, not because they changed, but because your lens did. This insight is not meant to confuse you. It's meant to free you. Because if perception is not the ultimate truth, if it's empty of inherent nature, then you're not doomed to be trapped inside your current view. You can step back. You can see how what you see is shaped. And that space is the beginning of freedom. Modern science confirms this more than ever. Neuroscientists describe perception as an active process of prediction and correction. Your brain doesn't simply receive data, it guesses what should be there based on prior input. In this way, perception is more like hallucination, agreed upon by consensus. This doesn't mean reality doesn't exist. It means we rarely see it directly. The 2nd century Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna once wrote, "Things derive their being and nature by mutual dependence and are nothing in themselves." It's a radical idea that no thing, including a thought or an object, has a fixed identity outside of the conditions and relationships that bring it into experience. But it's also deeply liberating. Think about how often suffering arises from mistaking perception for reality. You assume someone's silence means they're angry. You believe your fear means something terrible is about to happen. You see failure as proof of your worthlessness. But when you pause and truly examine what you're perceiving, you begin to see the cracks, the gaps, the assumptions. In this space of inquiry, everything begins to soften. That silence could mean many things. That fear could just be a passing surge in the body. That failure could be a step, not a definition. When you see perception as empty, you stop clinging to it as absolute. And that's when something miraculous happens. Clarity arises. One woman, after a painful breakup, believed her ex-partner had betrayed her and that she was doomed to repeat this pattern forever. In therapy, she was asked to slow down and examine the story in her mind. Bit by bit, she realized that her perception was built not just on what happened, but on a lifetime of abandonment and self-doubt. The truth wasn't black and white. There was complexity. There was nuance. And in seeing that, she stopped reliving the pain like a movie on loop. She began to breathe again. This doesn't mean we distrust all perception. It means we meet perception with humility, with awareness. We learn to ask, what else might be here? What's underneath this reaction? What part of me is seeing this way? This is not detachment, it's intimacy. Because in seeing perception clearly, we come closer to seeing ourselves clearly. Not the story, but the storyteller. Thich Nhat Hanh often reminded his students, perception is made of non-perception elements, meaning what we see is made of many things we cannot see. The mood we're in, the culture we live in, the wounds we carry, the needs we haven't voiced. When we bring this understanding to daily life, we stop reacting. We start responding with presence. Seeing through perception also invites us into deeper compassion. When we understand that others, too, are looking through their own lenses, we become softer. We realize that the person arguing with us may not be seeing us, but a parent, or a memory, or a fear. And rather than escalating, we listen, not to be right, but to connect. To live the emptiness of perception is to walk through the world with open eyes and an open mind. It is to accept that we never see the full picture, and yet we keep looking, keep listening, keep showing up. Not to find certainty, but to cultivate presence. What you see is not all there is. And that's not a flaw in your perception. That's an invitation to go deeper, to look again, and maybe, this time, to see with new eyes. Emptiness in practice. Meditation as the gateway. Emptiness is not meant to be just understood. It's meant to be lived. No amount of intellectual study can replace what arises when the mind quiets and awareness deepens. That's why in Buddhism, emptiness is not merely a doctrine, it's a doorway. And meditation is how we step through. Most people come to meditation seeking relief from anxiety, from distraction, from the heaviness of their own thoughts. And yes, meditation can calm the nervous system. It can quiet the mind. But its deepest gift is not just relaxation. It's revelation. Meditation reveals what's real, not in theory, but in direct experience. Sit for a few minutes, and you'll notice your thoughts come and go like waves. Emotions rise and fall like weather. Sensations flicker, vanish, reappear. Even your breath, so familiar, moves in and out without needing your control. And in the midst of all this movement, one thing becomes clear: nothing holds still. There is no fixed point to grab onto. Everything is in motion. Everything is arising and dissolving. At first, this can feel disorienting. We're so used to assuming that stability means control, that peace means holding things in place. But what meditation shows us is that real stability doesn't come from gripping. It comes from resting in the one thing that doesn't change, awareness itself. You begin to see that the self you thought was you is just another pattern of thought. That judgment is just a mental habit. That emotion is just energy moving through the body. And when you stop identifying with every cloud that passes, you begin to notice the sky. This is where emptiness begins to move from concept to insight. Not because you believe it, but because you see it. You feel it. You know it, not as knowledge, but as clarity. When the Buddha said, "In what is seen, there is only the seen," he wasn't speaking in riddles. He was pointing to direct experience. When you hear a sound in meditation, a bird, a passing car, the breath, it simply arises. Without your narrative, without your identity. It just is. In that moment, the boundary between me and the world softens. There's no need to label, judge, or control. There's just presence. Spacious, quiet, alive. Modern neuroscience now backs this up. Studies on mindfulness and meditation show that the more we observe experience without judgment, the less activity occurs in the default mode network of the brain, the part linked to ego, rumination, and narrative making. In simple terms, when you stop clinging to the story of self, your brain stops working so hard to defend it. One practitioner shared this. "I sat in silence and watched a thought arise. I'm not doing this right. And for the first time, I didn't believe it. I saw it float by like a leaf. And suddenly I was free. Not because the thought stopped, but because I stopped clinging." This is the shift. Not eliminating thought, but shifting your relationship to it. From fusion to freedom. Meditation also teaches us to see the emptiness of emotions. Not by denying them, but by witnessing their impermanence. Anger that once felt like a firestorm dissolves. Sadness that once seemed endless softens into space. Joy that surged now fades. You begin to notice, this is not me. This is something happening. And in that noticing, compassion arises, not just for yourself, but for others who are also riding waves they didn't choose. Some people think emptiness means disconnection or numbness. But it's the opposite. The more you see that nothing is fixed, the more tender you become. Why? Because you realize how fragile and precious every moment is. You don't hold on out of fear, you let go out of love. Zen master Shunryu Suzuki once said, "When you realize everything changes, there is nothing you try to hold on to. And when you are not holding on to anything, you begin to enjoy everything." That's the paradox. The less you cling, the more you feel. The more you release, the more fully you live. Meditation isn't about achieving something. It's about letting go of everything that's not true. It's not about becoming better. It's about becoming real. And in becoming real, you return to the ground of being that was never missing. You stop searching for stillness because you realize you are stillness when you're not chasing, not resisting, not pretending. Emptiness, through meditation, reveals itself as freedom. Not freedom from life, but freedom within life. The freedom to meet pain without being defined by it. The freedom to experience joy without grasping. The freedom to walk through change with an open hand. One morning, a teacher asked her students to sit and simply listen. No guidance, no mantra, no technique, just listen. After 10 minutes, she said, "What did you hear?" One student answered, "Bird song, the wind, distant traffic." The teacher nodded. "Now tell me, what did you resist?" The room fell silent. That's when the practice began. Meditation is not a method for avoiding the world. It's a practice for seeing it clearly and returning to it with wisdom. It doesn't remove us from reality. It removes the veils we've placed between ourselves and reality. And in that unveiling, we discover the truth. Nothing is separate. Nothing is fixed. And because of that, everything is possible. This is the gift of practice. Not answers, not escape, but seeing, direct, gentle, uncompromising. The more you sit with life, the less you need to control it. The more you witness experience, the less you become trapped in it. The more you let things arise and pass, the more you realize there was never anything solid to hold in the first place. And that, paradoxically, is where peace begins. Emptiness in relationship, loving without holding on. We are wired for connection. From our earliest moments, we reach for touch, for recognition, for warmth. Relationships are where we seek safety, intimacy, meaning, but they are also where we often experience our deepest wounds. Why? Because we don't just love, we cling. We don't just connect, we grasp. And what we cling to most tightly is not always the person themselves, but the idea of them, the story, the security, the identity they reinforce in us. In Buddhist practice, the teaching of emptiness invites us to see our relationships differently, not as bonds between two solid, separate selves, but as living, breathing exchanges between two impermanent, interdependent streams of experience. It invites us to love not by holding on, but by letting be. This doesn't mean we stop caring. It means we stop confusing love with control. We stop assuming permanence in something that is always changing. Every person, every emotion, every moment, constantly shifting. When we ignore this truth, we suffer. When we embrace it, we open. Imagine holding water in your hand. The tighter you grip, the more it slips through your fingers. But when you cup your hand gently, it remains. This is how love rooted in emptiness feels: present, open, tender, but ungrasping. It doesn't demand. It listens. It doesn't possess. It witnesses. One man shared that after years of trying to fix his partner, help her become more calm, more spiritual, more like him, he realized that his version of love was laced with fear. Fear that she might not meet his needs. Fear that if she changed too much or not enough, the relationship would crumble. Underneath his care was control. And underneath that control was a self trying not to fall apart. When he began to meditate and study emptiness, he didn't stop loving her. He started loving her more clearly, without projecting, without molding, just seeing. Another woman, grieving the end of a long friendship, said she kept replaying old conversations, wondering what went wrong. In time, she realized she wasn't mourning just the friend, but the version of herself she had been with that friend. The loss wasn't only relational, it was existential. Who am I without this connection? What if I never feel that safe again? These questions reveal how much of our identity is woven through others, which is not wrong, but dangerous if unconscious. When we are unaware of the way we lean on others to stabilize our sense of self, we become reactive, defensive, fearful of any change in the dynamic. But when we see the interdependent, impermanent nature of relationship, we begin to soften. We begin to relate, not to who someone was or who we want them to be, but to who they are right now. This is love aligned with emptiness. A love that doesn't demand consistency, but honors presence. A love that isn't rigid, but fluid. Like waves dancing on the surface of the ocean, not trying to hold shape, just moving in rhythm, together. Modern psychology increasingly supports this view. Attachment theory teaches us that secure relationships are not built on possession, but trust and emotional attunement. Dr. Dan Siegel speaks of mindsight, the ability to perceive another person's inner world without collapsing into it or trying to control it. This aligns beautifully with Buddhist mindfulness. To see clearly without grasping, to love without fusing. But this kind of love takes practice. It asks us to be aware of our stories, our expectations, our old wounds. It asks us to pause before reacting, to ask, am I seeing this person, or am I seeing my fear? Am I loving them, or am I trying to fix the past through them? Sometimes the most powerful act of love is letting go, not of the person, but of the version of them we're clinging to. When we release our grip, we create space for them to grow, for ourselves to grow. And even if the relationship ends, it ends with dignity. with gratitude, not with bitterness born from unmet illusions. This doesn't mean relationships don't hurt. They do. Loss hurts. Change hurts. But much of our pain comes not from what's happening, but from the way we resist what's happening. We believe love should last a certain way, feel a certain way, look a certain way. And when it doesn't, we tighten. We blame. We mourn a version of reality that never actually existed. When we see through the lens of emptiness, we don't become cold or distant. We become real, present to the fullness of the moment, able to say, "I love you," without needing it to mean forever. Able to receive someone's presence without needing to own it. Able to allow space within. The bond, space to breathe, space to change, space to simply be. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, "You must love in such a way that the other person feels free." That is the heart of relational emptiness. Love is freedom. Love is openness. Love is an offering, not a demand. This kind of love doesn't just change our relationships. It changes us. It rewires the way we approach connection. From scarcity to sufficiency. From fear to curiosity. From attachment to care. We stop asking, "What can I get from this person?" and start asking, "How can I be fully here with them?" We stop trying to keep things from ending and instead pour our attention into how we meet them, honestly, compassionately, fully. To love from emptiness is to love from abundance, not of things, but of space. You no longer love in order to fill a hole. You love because the heart has realized it was never empty. It was always wide enough to hold the changing tides of intimacy with grace. This is not easy, but it is worth it. Because in learning to love without holding on, we begin to taste a kind of freedom that no relationship, no title, no label could ever provide. A freedom that lives at the heart of love itself. Emptiness as liberation, letting go into freedom. Letting go is not something Western culture teaches well. We are taught to pursue, to acquire, to hold on. Achievements, possessions, identities, people. Letting go, in this context, often feels like failure, like loss, like giving up. But what if letting go isn't defeat at all? What if it's the beginning of real freedom? In the heart of Buddhist teaching, emptiness and liberation are inseparable. Emptiness reveals that nothing, no thought, no thing, no self, has an independent, fixed nature. Liberation is what happens when we stop clinging to that illusion. The moment we stop trying to solidify the unsolidifiable, space opens. Breathing becomes easier. The grip inside our chest begins to soften. This is not a philosophical idea, it's a lived experience. Anyone who has carried a grudge, a tightly held belief, or an identity wrapped in fear knows the weight it creates. We protect our stories like armor, but that armor becomes a prison. The fear of losing control, of not being enough, of facing the unknown. These are walls we live inside. And emptiness, gently but firmly, invites us to walk through them. Letting go in this context doesn't mean detaching from life. It means dropping the illusion that we can control it. It means releasing the inner tightness that demands life match our expectations. We don't stop caring, we stop clinging. And in that subtle shift, everything changes. One man described sitting in meditation, wrestling with anger toward his brother. The story was years old, but it lived in his body like it had happened yesterday. He realized, in a moment of silence, that the pain wasn't coming from the past. It was coming from the clinging to the past. The identity of the one who was wronged had become part of his self-image. When he saw this, a strange grief rose. And then, peace. Not because the hurt was erased, but because the holding was released. This is the liberation emptiness offers. Not an escape from difficulty, but freedom within it. A freedom that arises when we stop demanding that life be different from what it is. That doesn't mean we don't act. We can respond. We can speak truth. We can make change. but we do it from spaciousness, not from contraction, from clarity, not from compulsion. In this way, emptiness is a mirror. It reflects the fact that everything we try to grasp, pleasure, certainty, identity, is already in motion, always changing. Trying to hold on is like trying to hold smoke. You exhaust yourself, and still it slips through your fingers. But when you stop trying to catch it, something beautiful happens. You become present. You start to see the play of life as it is, not as you want it to be. And from that seeing, compassion grows. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from craving, from clinging. And the end of suffering comes from letting go. This doesn't mean becoming passive, it means becoming real. In fact, some of the most courageous acts are born not from grasping, but from release. Forgiveness, grief, surrender. These aren't signs of weakness. They're signs that we're no longer enslaved by fear. In a culture built on control, this can sound radical. But what has all that control brought us? Chronic stress, anxiety, division, exhaustion. When we hold life with clenched fists, we miss its beauty. When we open our hands, we start to feel again, to connect again, to live. There is a reason why the great spiritual masters speak not of conquering, but of surrender, not of victory, but of peace. When the Dalai Lama was asked how he deals with loss, he said, "I let it go, not with bitterness, not with denial, but with a heart soft enough to feel and strong enough to release." Letting go does not mean indifference. It means wisdom. It means seeing that clinging creates suffering and choosing freedom instead. It means recognizing that nothing we grasp is truly ours, not our bodies, not our thoughts, not even the people we love. Everything is on loan from the universe. When we understand that, we treat life with reverence. We stop trying to own, and we begin to honor. This shift can happen in the smallest moments. The breath you release, instead of holding. The thought you let pass instead of following. The harsh word you choose not to say. The apology you offer without expectation. Every act of letting go is an act of freedom. And over time, it becomes a way of being. There is a teaching that says, just as the ocean has one taste, the taste of salt, so too the Buddhist teaching has one taste, the taste of liberation. Emptiness is not about becoming detached or aloof. It's about discovering that beneath all the noise, the pushing, the fear, there is a quiet clarity, a space. And that space is not emptiness as absence. It is fullness. It is peace. It is the place where life can flow freely. This is not something to achieve. It is something to recognize. And every moment we stop clinging is a moment we return to it. Every time we let go, we return home. Letting go is not a single act. It's a practice, a way of meeting each moment as it is, not as we wish it to be. A way of walking through the world with open eyes and open hands. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it. Because in that letting go, we touch what we were seeking all along. Not power, not certainty, not permanence, but peace. The fullness within emptiness. Emptiness, for many, begins as a mystery, maybe even a threat, but when lived, when felt through the body and breathed through the heart, it reveals something unexpected, not loss, but spaciousness, not absence, but freedom. And in that freedom, something beautiful happens. Life begins to move through us with ease, clarity, and quiet joy. We've walked through many doors together. We've seen how the self is not a solid thing, but a flowing process. How everything we call a thing exists only through relationships. How even our perception is shaped by countless hidden conditions. We've sat in stillness, not to escape life, but to see it clearly. And we've touched love, not as possession, but as presence. Through it all, one truth has echoed again and again. The more we let go, the more fully we live. This is the paradox at the heart of emptiness. When we stop clinging, when we release the desperate need to hold life in place, we don't fall into a void. We fall into reality. And reality, stripped of illusion, is tender and wild and astonishingly full. To live from emptiness is not to withdraw from the world, but to walk through it with open hands. To feel more, not less. To hurt, yes, but also to heal. To lose, yes, but also to love more honestly. This is not detachment. This is intimacy without grasping, compassion without control, freedom that grows from deep understanding. And perhaps this is what the Buddha pointed to all along. Not a doctrine, not a dogma, but a way of seeing that returns us to what we already are, aware, connected, whole. The taste of emptiness, it turns out, is the taste of peace. A peace not dependent on conditions, not born of perfection, but revealed in the simple willingness to stop clinging and just be. If this journey has stirred something in you, if even one moment felt like home, you're not alone. There are countless others walking this same quiet path of awakening. And if you wish to continue walking with us, to sit with these questions, these mysteries, these moments of clarity, then we invite you to stay close. Subscribe to this channel, share this space with someone you care about, and revisit the videos that speak to you when the noise of the world grows loud. Let this be a refuge, not from life, but into it, into the kind of seeing that frees the heart, again and again. Thank you for being here, for listening not just with your ears, but with your whole self. May the path ahead be soft with insight, spacious with compassion, and grounded in the fullness of emptiness.